have been around for that whole long ride, and now it becomes a challenge as to how to present that and not to lose that context. And that's what I tried to do in this PowerPoint. Often we'll see the way to combat these trade agreements is to pick them apart and to look at each section, which I am going to do today as well, and point out how undemocratic they are and how expensive they're going to be and loss of sovereignty. But what I want to do today is to show that all that is important in making the case, but I think it's also very important to reframe things now, to go back and look at what free trade really is and whether it really followed what it was supposed to be doing, and the same with globalization. And I think we'll come to some important answers that perhaps need to be part of the picture as we go forward, especially since every single day as I track what's happening with the global corporate economy, I see failures written all over everything. So it's going to move us, it might move us beyond the nitty-gritty before long into what, as the IISD said yesterday or the day before, the need for Canada to be actually negotiating new kinds of trade deals that are appropriate for the 21st century that we're now living in. So anyway, there's a little bit of an introduction. I'll probably cover some of that again, but let's get started now. And it's great to be here with all of you. I gather you're organizers, and that's so important. One of the things we're hearing today is that it's really important for governments to know that people, care about these things. And that still does mean people in the streets as well as people writing letters. And so Council of the Canadians has always been so great at being on the forefront of that kind of activism, which is one thing I very much admire about the Council. So that's just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be talking about, the global economic context, the free trade and globalization context. What does free trade mean within globalization? The mega trade agreements and the TPP, what is it and where is it and why is it? I think that's the very important thing, the why. We don't always look at that, and I think we need to. And then the impacts of TPP. And I've done TPP more than CETA because that's what I started out working on, but I do throw some things in about CETA as well. And then some recommendations that I've tried to pick recommendations that have already been made publicly by the Council of Canadians, by the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and one or two of my own, and those might be helpful going forward as well. So those are the categories. So with the corporate economic globalization, I think it's important to go back. I could go right back to Adam Smith. I've done some research on that, but for now we'll just look at the time when globalization and neoliberalism, as we sometimes call it, came into the picture, and it happened with some structural economic shifts back in the late 70s. And at that time, the old Keynesian type system and social democracy didn't seem to be working, and the economies were faltering. And unfortunately, in that void, some very right-wing neoliberal, well, they weren't called that at the time, but some very right-wing economists filled that gap. And two of them were Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, and you may have heard of those names. And they influenced economists to favor free market capitalism, and at the same time the politicians like Thatcher and Reagan bought into that whole model. We heard the name "There is no alternative," TINA, and so they sold it as if there was no alternative, and that's a very dangerous thing, in terms of keeping free speech and free thought afoot in the world. And at the time, we had Brian Mulroney here, who was also a big cheerleader for free trade. And it sounded good. It sounded good at the time. But, actually, none of the politicians had read it. Not one American paid $30,000 to anyone that had read it. And he didn't lose any money on that. It also goes back to a report that Maud and Tony, in some of their early books, they they mention this quite frequently, and that is the report on the crisis of democracy, which said that we have a crisis of democracy in the world, and it can best be solved by transnational corporations. And so this was the kind of the outline that we often used in the earlier days to examine how the corporate economic model was working. And basically it had free market rules, free trade, which of course is always considered a major driver of economic growth, privatization, deregulation, smaller government, cutting public expenditures for social services like health, education, and so on, and money for the poor, and eliminating the concept of the public good and replacing it with individual responsibility. And of course that has carried through from that time till today, although now we're seeing changes, but up until recently in Canada. I had a clickable link here to Susan George, who is one of the older European intellectuals who's been an academic and a very activist person in the anti-globalization movement as well. And now she's written yet another book. I believe she's in her 80s now. It's called Shadow Sovereigns, How Global Corporations Are Seizing Power. And the one thing I would point out about this is that she says, and this is from observing what's been happening in Europe, and in regard to the CETA, we need to be cognizant of this. And she's explaining how corporations have taken over all branches of government as well as international governance, in particular through trade treaties, such as this, the proposed CETA and TTIP. And in the World Economic Forum, they have this initiative. I hadn't even realized this until I read her book. It's called the Global Redesign Initiative. And it's very frightening because it's 84 committees that are set up now, and they basically are rewriting, they're rewriting the rules for governments, national governments. And so you can see that in certain aspects of the TPP, especially the regulatory coherence chapter, and you can see how they're really delimiting the ability of our national governments to make the rules and the regulations. And then finally, she points out the incursion of the corporations into the UN. And I know that goes well back anyway. And I know Maud has fought, and the other water activists in United Nations fora where the corporations have been trying to take over. And so anyway, these are just some of the names for corporate economic globalization. Neoliberalism, which is a term commonly used in the Americas, global capitalism and laissez-faire global capitalism. The Washington Consensus is another name that seemed to follow on that report on the excess of democracy. McWorld, and neoclassical economics would be the actual economic term, and that goes back over 100 years. It's a new version of that on steroids. And the French call it la pensée unique, which is just a really, a term that kind of makes fun of the whole thing. And the third way in the UK. And interestingly enough, the third way was the way some academics described the time when Tony Blair took over. And now, just yesterday, I read an article on a very good website called Social Europe, which puts out about 3 papers a day from intellectuals all over the world, and especially in Europe. And there was one saying, is the third way dead? And I think probably it is. So some of the neoliberal structures, and we're going to go in the next slide, we'll see more about the different trade agreements, but it's important to know that the GATT, that was the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which went back to after the war when they were trying to rehabilitate the world and Europe especially, which had been devastated and flattened. They decided back around 1999 that it wasn't moving fast enough because they only met every 4 years to try to bring down the tariffs to move towards a one world economy. And so there, at the Uruguay meeting around in the late 90s, the corporations became very involved, and they helped to write the World Trade Organization rules and GATT, which was the service side. The World Bank is another big player, the IMF, then the Free Trade Secretariats, especially NAFTA. That's a very influential one because that's when the investor state ISDS first came. And then the Bank for International Settlements, and that's a whole side story, but the financing is, along with trade, two of the most critical aspects of all the downsides of this. And then the World Economic Forum, which I just mentioned to you in terms of the Global Redesign Initiative. And so then we have these myths that have accompanied capitalism and neoliberalism along the way, which I think all of them now, you'll agree, we have been exposed, and thanks to all of the ecological analysis that's going on, that the earth is inexhaustible and nature's a giant machine. This is the old mechanistic way of looking at the world. Life is a struggle where only the fittest survive. The market corrects economic gaps and will make everything run smoothly, and so on. I mean, and these are the basic assumptions in this model. And again, it's useful to expose that. And then these are all of the other things that neoliberalism was supposed to bring us: democracy and more prosperity, and eliminate poverty and better human rights, and through agribusiness we were supposed to reduce world hunger and all of that. And anyway, we can see in most of those areas that has failed. It may have worked for a while with some of those new economies in Singapore where many jobs were created, but in the end we were just building up a whole lot of externalities that would come back to haunt us. So, and in terms of the failures of neoliberalism, which I was just speaking about, these are just some of the things that have come out within the last few months. And I mentioned that the third way is dead. It was actually Le Monde, that's Le Monde Diplomatique, is a left-wing newspaper in France. There's a new book out called Post-Capitalism, A Guide to Our Future. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Kondratiev's cycles, but that's the theory that which is shown and demonstrated that the whole global the capitalist system operates in waves, long waves of 50 years, where the growth rises and then it goes into depressions for quite a few years. And we should be coming out of that fourth or fifth wave now, and it's not happening. And now we're moving to major economists like Robert Gordon and Larry Summers, suggesting that we're in something called secular stagnation, and we may be there for, Larry says 10, the other guy says 25 years. In other words, we have reached probably the end of growth, financially as well as ecologically. And there are many, many more that I could cite. And those are just the ones who have been in the mainstream, who are suddenly getting it, whereas there's a whole host of other kinds of economists and bioeconomic economists, ecological economists, and degrowth. There's a whole field that have been explaining this all along. So now I hope to get some of that out there so we can see. I'm just looking for my arrow. Okay, so that's a very quick run through the globalization context, bringing us right up to present. And then let's go on to free trade and globalization. And here, how are we doing for time, Sujata? I guess we just started 10 minutes ago, right?
Right, okay. We've got 13:21 right now, so we've got about 40 or 50 minutes left.
Okay, so I mentioned the trade agreements going back to the GATT. And I often, when I was teaching, I used to say the GATT begat the WTO. And I've heard many people speak that were there. I've heard one professor speak who was there. And but basically what one reads is that it was basically the corporations that were writing that agreement. And then the next big one that came along was NAFTA, which we've mentioned. And we know the big thing about NAFTA was that it included the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which before was not part of trade agreements. The multilateral agreement on investment was all of the OECD countries. That's 28 countries, including the European countries and Canada and the US and a few others. And they were signing an agreement that basically had a very similar mechanism to the one in NAFTA. But that was defeated. And a lot of us were online fighting that one, sharing information all around the world, getting websites up, and finally getting information to the politicians who knew nothing about it. And finally, the European Parliament defeated it and we got to enough of the parliamentarians throughout Europe, and they realized what it meant. So time and again, when people see into the depths of these agreements, they start to get it, that it's not on the side of parliamentary democracy or whatever. The FTAA, that was Free Trade Area of the Americas, they wanted to open up all of the Americas from tip to toe for big development, major superhighways, canals, everything to open it up and play havoc, of course, with the environment and the native peoples. That was defeated. Some of us, I know when I was there with Sierra Club, and Elizabeth had rented a very large rooming house just under the hill where all the big meetings were taking place and where the protests were happening every day. And it was quite exciting to be there with helicopters flying overhead and smoke, fumes, gas fumes everywhere. Anyway, it wasn't just our protest, although it was a huge one with 60 or 80, 60, more than 60,000 people. But later, all through the Americas, the people protested as well. And I remember being at the World Social Forum in 2003, and we marched in the streets with 130,000 people, I think, with nary a policeman in sight. You know, it was all very peaceful. But they were marching against this free trade area of the Americas and the Iraq War as well at the same time. But anyway, that was defeated, although throughout the Harper reign, it was always on his agenda to try to reestablish that whole free trade area. Now what we have is all we have with the TPP. There are only two countries that signed on to that, Chile and Peru. So the others did not want to fall into that gambit. The SPP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America, that was a huge struggle and battle. And it was eventually defeated at Montebello. And again, the council played a huge role in that and in exposing it for what it really was. And then, of course, there's been many bilateral agreements. And I remember the CCFTA, that was a big one that we fought long and hard for about a year through the Trade Justice Network. That's the Canadian-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And we didn't want to sign it because Colombia has such horrendous human rights violations. But some of the politicians thought, well, that's the only way we can bring them around is if we sign up and become friends with them. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened with the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Then we get into the era of the mega agreements, CETA, TTIP, TPP, TISA. And some of you may not have heard of TISA, and that's a scary one because it's an agreement with services. So they aim to liberalize worldwide trade of services such as banking, education, healthcare, and so on. And this could be this is going to have to be a big battle as well, and hopefully the unions are already working on this. But Dr. Patricia Ranald from the University of Sydney, she said amendments from the U.S. are seeking to end publicly provided services like public pension funds, which are referred to as monopolies, if you can imagine. But this is something that the neoliberals have do. You know, they always name our public services and our public sector what we always considered to be our rights. They try to frame them in this other way and call it a monopoly because they should have more input into it and so on. So that's another one of the mega agreements. Now, what I want to do here very briefly is to show how the whole, go back and look at free trade for what it is, and to see if we can make an argument there, as well as just by picking apart the TPP or the CETA or the ISDS. And one way I found useful, I first read about it from David Korten, who you may remember as the way back when we were just starting all the anti-globalization work. He did When Corporations Rule the World, and it was a very influential book. And so he reminds us that David Ricardo, who was one of the early economists, just 50 years after Adam Smith, and he proposed that we would have comparative advantage if we traded in a particular way between nations that had one advantage over another. But he said that the trade between the partners must be balanced and investment capital must be anchored locally. So David Korten has picked up on that, and he says, however, market fundamentalists conveniently ignore the conditions for comparative advantage. And this is important because even in almost all of the trade agreements the government signs, they will say the big advantage is economic, more jobs, higher GDP, and then they'll also say, they'll cite the comparative advantage for us, even though, look at this, it's not really any more comparative advantage because we ignore these conditions that were there originally for free trade, that it would operate within a nation state. And each of the trading partners countries must be largely self-reliant in meeting its own needs, trade only its surplus with its neighbors, keep exports and imports in balance, and keep capital ownership national. And this is a huge issue in Canada now because we have a major court case with Rocco Galati, which has, I think, just been defeated. But to try to see if we can keep our Bank of Canada, which from the 30s to the 70s, created most of the things we're proud of, you know, the healthcare system and the canals and the highways and the health system and everything. Anyway, and then we sold out to the Bank of International Settlements and started borrowing from private banks. So this whole business about where the financing comes from, you know, I think Ricardo saw that was essential. He saw that in those days people wouldn't want to leave, you know, and invest their money in another country. They wanted to be where they trusted people. And so I think that's why you can have an invisible hand talked about in those days, because you were near where your money was invested. So anyway, Corton goes on to show us how this kind of an economy is not an ideal one to foster at this time in history. So I want to also, in terms of the free trade system, point this out to you, and I probably won't have time to go through it all today, but I've been seen David Herman Daly's name for years and years, but I've picked up just in the last few years on the things he had to say about free trade. And in his famous book, Beyond Growth, which I think I've got a picture of, there it is right there, he has a chapter, Free Trade and Globalization versus Environment and Community. And he presents a summary case against the overall policy of economic integration by free trade, which I've got on the next page, and free capital mobility. But he also goes on to say how he has been able very easily to deconstruct the two most usual objections to the case. So people will always come back at him and say, oh, but economic growth induced by free trade is such a benefit that it outweighs whatever costs it entails. Well, we can certainly make that argument now, and I've got some more specific research that just came out a few months ago to show that. And also that the principle of comparative advantage from Ricardo gives a blessing to free trade, and globalization is currently understood. Well, we see from what I just said from the last slide that that's not the case either. And he says he was able to make that argument. It was strikingly easy to make that argument. So I think that this is critical. I was doing some work on the concept of planned degrowth, and it came up again that Daly says the only way that we can hope to have a sustainable society, an ecologically sustainable society, is to have control closer to home at a national or subnational level. That's the way, and he calls for tariffs to make that possible. And these are things we're going to have to consider going forward, as they say. We're going to somehow have to get control again if we want that to happen, I think. So here's some of his case against free trade. First of all, the high cost of energy-intensive transport, and you think that that's already failing. All those huge, huge cargo ships laden with boxes and containers from China, they're all imports now. There's some kind of index out, I forget what it's called, it's something like Britex or something, and it shows it's the lowest it's been, and these ships are hauled up in ports all around the Atlantic and throughout. There's nothing for them now. So what folly to build all those things, just like the big cities in China that they built that are sitting empty, whole cities. So just to go back to this, so he says that, so those are all the things that he points to, and we know most of these. This comes out in the anti-globalization literature as well. It may be said slightly differently, but we know we don't want increased dependence on distant supplies and markets. It's too easy for them to be disrupted with wars, and as he says, huge disasters like the tsunami and the Fukushima. And they also lead to reduced range of choice of occupation, and firms in competitive environment all have an incentive to externalize costs, and that's not good. That means that they ignore our laws and that we are put there to protect us. And we see that. I love this graphic that some of you may be familiar with from Canadian CCPA, and all the things that are going into the meat grinder of the corporate hog farms and threatening small family farms, jobs, public health, environment, clean water, air quality, everything. When we move to these mega agreements, we have to remember all of the things that we're losing. And then we see, if we look at these agreements like the TPP and the regulatory chapter and the investor state chapter, how there's things built into those agreements, you know, to allow this to happen and to diminish our laws that are in place. And that is a frightening thing. Finally, and this is a really crucial one, and this is him speaking 20 years ago. He saw the natural capital as the limiting factor. So that's the limits to ecological growth that he's talking about. And there's so much being written about that now, not just peak oil, which we see actually there is oil around, but it's peaked for another reason still. But there's peak other minerals as well. And so we can't be digging up the planet at the rate that we've been doing anymore. We've reached a point where we're feeling the crunch. And let me just go. And so I think that this is a good mental model to keep in mind, and probably most of you have seen something like this, and it's been the other way around. And now we have to recognize that the environment is our vessel that we live in, and the society lives only because of that environment, and the economy must fit within that. I remember a conference, it was the Council of Canadians, when they went across the country trying to get the pulse of the nation on something. I forget which it was now, but they were meeting at Mount St. Vincent, and David Suzuki was on the panel that they had. And he said he was just taking a course on economics at UBC, his first course. And he only lasted about 3 weeks because he couldn't stand the premises and the assumptions of a traditional economics course that didn't recognize that the environment is the crucial thing. So now, thanks to many people who have gone before us, and thanks to the awareness of climate change that's happening, we're starting to see a trend in the other direction now. And so that's, and then in terms of debunking the whole free trade system and looking at the failures, another important thing to look at are the studies that have come out, and they've been out ever since earlier days of NAFTA, that we don't even have we're not getting the benefits that were promised. And you see, sometimes we have to wait for these studies to come out and let us know that. Our own Canadian economist, he's now with, what's it called, Unifor, and he said that there's been no gain at all for the average Canadian and the average worker since 1980. And later on, I've got a study on the TPP that was just done by Tufts University, GDAE, Global Development and Environmental Group, that shows that there's nothing. They said there might be minimal economic benefits over the next 10 years for the TPP. And now the studies that were done with a proper UN model, with the proper assumptions, is showing that there is not any benefit at all in terms of the economy, and not with jobs either, that we actually lose jobs. Are facts that we really need to get out there. And there's a conference coming up April 1st in Ottawa, at the University of Ottawa, and the author of that study that I just mentioned, referenced from Tufts University, I forget his name, it's like Calabro or something, he is going to be there. And so this is the kind of information we really need to start spreading around. And Joseph Stiglitz, whose name you see, he is coming out so strongly now against the TPP. He's speaking everywhere, and he is going to be at that conference on April 1st. I think I'm going to have to fly up for this one. And And this is really important, he says, it is one of the basic principles of economics that trade is good and more trade is better. But some economists have come to doubt the relevance of that orthodoxy. The costs of globalization have been greater and more enduring than they expected, and government efforts to mitigate the impact on American workers have often proved insufficient. So what else did he say here? The argument was always that the winners could compensate the losers, he said, but the winners never do. And that becomes particularly relevant when we have a society with as much inequality. So I think that, we're starting to see the orthodox position of economics now turning to a more heterodox, I think they call it, kind of model. So the TPP then, we've got a background now of how to look at these trade agreements within the context of the bigger picture of free trade, which is, don't forget, the major growth generator for global corporate capitalism, if you want to call it that. And so you can see where it is. It's, the countries, I think. I don't need to mention that again. I'm going to skip that one, but it's in about 2 years' time, or possibly before, if they get enough countries signing on ahead of time, which I hope they don't. And they only need a certain number of countries that create about 85% of the combined GDP to sign on. Those are our own guys, Scott Sinclair and Stuart True, who are doing wonderful writing on the TPP, and only thing they've said there is that it's NAFTA on steroids. It used to be called NAFTA of the Pacific. And here's our own Council of Canadians protesting about the secret negotiations going on, and Sierra Club picked up on that in the United States, and made the note that anything behind closed doors must be bad for those of us that are locked out, which indeed is the case. And that's the other thing, that hundreds of big corporations got to see this, got to help plan it, and politicians themselves were not allowed to see it, or they had to go into a basement and read it and not take it home and not photocopy anything. So that tells us something, doesn't it, about who's in control. So we know what it is. I'm going to suggest that it's not just the things we usually hear in the government documents, but it's a global corporate power vehicle, and it's a global investment agreement that benefits the corporations. Even the new CETA investor court system, which was supposed to quell the rebellion of citizens in Europe against it. We just were Sujata and I, on a webinar the other day, and there's still a huge amount of criticism about what they are proposing as a new and better court. So let's see, I think that's all we need to say about that. I'm not going to go into all this, but you can see this is a 6,000-page document with all of those chapters. So what I'm going to do is just pick out a few of the chapters and the sectors that we are concerned about in this country. I'm not going to be able to click on these. We tried, but if you want, when you go back to look at this online, you'll be able to click on those links, and you'll get short little videos, which are quite good, and they help you conceptualize the actual trade agreement, especially its negative aspects, quite quickly. And this is a good little one, the third one down that just came out, fact-checking the president. So you see the president, making these great pronouncements, and then you get Lori Wallach, who's a great international trade lawyer for Public Citizen, Ralph Nader's organization originally, and Joseph Stiglitz. And so that's really worth seeing.
Janet, there's 20 minutes left, but I could actually do a screen share and click on the links myself if you want to show one of them.
Maybe at the end. Let me just go through, and then I'll pick. Okay, why don't you? How long would it take you to do that? Well, no, let's not interrupt. Let's do it at the very end, okay?
Okay.
Just in case anything goes wrong. So, and the why of it. So this is from the United States Trade Representative. So you see all these highfalutin things that are supposed to happen, raise the living standards, and we have to say of home, and productivity, and enhance innovation, and all of this, reduce poverty, good governance. Good governance for who? Because, as I said, with the Global Redesign Initiative, we know where that's going. But here's some things that we need to know about this. What are the political reasons? And I even think I even heard the trade minister interviewed on the House this morning. talking about political aspects of the TPP that are important for the U.S. in terms of the relations in the Far East. But what we know is, and this has been written up in journals like Foreign Policy, very reputable journals, that it's become one of the primary tools in the United States geopolitical pivot towards the Asia-Pacific. They're pivoting their policies in that direction because they would like to constrain and surround China and keep it on the outs, because they view China now as one of their major potential enemies in the future. I'm not sure now that China's economy is tanking so badly, but that was the plan anyway a couple years ago. So as the WTO became dysfunctional, and this whole multilateral free trade regime, which had its real concerns as well, has given way to what Stiglitz calls a discordant managed trade regime built on a divide and conquer strategy with overlapping trade blocks and agreements, according to Joseph Stiglitz, like I just said. Let's see, we know that it's covering more than 80% of the world. It's got a little docking mechanism so that other countries can join in. But here's the thing. The United States is in control of that. This is what Michael Geist was saying on the TPP webinar yesterday. I hadn't realized it, to what extent the United States controls this, what's being written in it, who's going to join in. When Canada joined, we were late to the table, and we had to go in with severe restraints, like making sure that we let some of our supply system go. And then I've already mentioned this, that TTIP is one of several mechanisms to enhance global corporate governance. So these are just some of the things we need to be aware of. And then the economic reasons, I've already mentioned that when I was talking about Herman Daly. You know, that these are the things that we always hear: increased integration in the global economy and increased growth in GDP, and increased jobs, increased markets, and so on. Well, this is the study I mentioned, the Global Development and Environment Institute, GDAE at Tufts, and I've been following them for quite a few years now, and this is very timely. They came out with a study just a few months ago, and well, just actually like 2 or 3 months ago, and they showed, and I mentioned this already, that the GDP will be lower, job growth, I said, well, I didn't tell you the numbers, will not materialize, and over all those countries, nearly looks like 770,000, nearly 1 million jobs will be lost, and 58,000 in Canada, as much as you can try to predict that, and income's not likely to decrease. So, and as I said, we're going to hear the author of that speaking soon in Ottawa. And this is Hadrian Mertens Kirkwood, a researcher with the CCPA. And he said if the TPP had a saving grace, an item for the pro list, it was that it was going to grow the economy and create jobs. So as the evidence mounts against even modest macroeconomic benefits, however, the trade-offs are looking increasingly unpalatable. So here's the question. Is the TPP worth it for Canada? We say no, and we think that Canadians agree. A deal that costs too much and delivers too little is not a deal that Canada needs. That's a good point, I think, that we should make when we're organizing against this. And this is a tariff logic. The tariffs are practically diminished at this point to 3% or 5%. And then also he's talking here about the amount of imports and exports that we have with some of these countries in the Far East. And they're going to be doing most of the importing, and it's going to increase our trade imbalance. So again, it doesn't make any sense from that perspective. So you have to wonder exactly what they're concerned about. Now this is a section I maybe just go through fairly quickly because there's quite a lot in it, but you can go back and look at it. I'll just read the highlights. The impacts on the healthcare system. This is from CCPA. Policy change could, in terms of the patents, could add $636 million annually to the price tag of drugs in Canada, and then another one on the impact of the whole system. It could weaken the Canadian public health care system, undermine health regulation, and obstruct efforts to renew and expand public health care. So, not good on the health side. The financial threats are huge in terms of blocking any kind of regulation on financial products, and even the risky ones that we've already seen that were so damaging in the 2008 financial collapse, they would be enabled again by this, according to what Public Citizen did in their initial analysis. I think this is another one that Council of Canadians will want to make, than they always have with these agreements, and that is about the impact on local government. And so I would recommend this paper that you see there. I think it's Jane Kelsey, the activist, lawyer, professor from New Zealand. Anyway, you can see in the top paragraph the list of the municipal activities that have the greatest potential to be affected, and policy making, bylaws, technical standards, public procurement contracts, and that's a big, huge one for any of us that are concerned about food. And I am living here in Wolfville in the Annapolis Valley, and having worked on the food movement here, and this is a huge issue for us to consider for our future. There's another window or lens into this as well. When we talk about the globalization, when we need to look at, there's a whole literature on collapse that I've been reading for years, and if you look at that model, if we assume that things could fall apart and governance might have to come back to a more local level, one of the things we want for sure is we want control over our own food. We want it now for safety reasons, but in the future it may well be for survival reasons. So we've got to really, I think, fight this one and get the municipalities on side right across this country. Labor impacts, this is just some of the things. The labor folks were the first ones off the mark to get in and see the trade minister, and you can see there what they were calling for. And this is a good article by Scott Sinclair and Stuart True on the costs and the impacts of the TPP in terms of intellectual property, affecting the cost of drugs, affecting our security and safety, and so on. And I just wanted to point out, you've all heard Jim Balsillie, I'm sure, on the radio, and he's really against it from his perspective as a big business person. And then Professor Michael Geist, I heard him speak yesterday, and he's probably one of the biggest experts in this country on intellectual property. Unfortunately, I didn't get his references from yesterday. They didn't publish them yet, or I would have put that in, but watch for that. And that's another one, just to show you that the World Bank, even the World Bank, is warning about intellectual property things that are in this TPP agreement. So when you get the World Bank concerned, we need to take note. And I just mentioned how important the small farms are going to be going forward, and how, if you remember that meat grinder diagram, how the big corporate farms destroy that. This is the National Farmers Union saying exactly the same thing. The environmental impacts, that's the analysis from Sierra Club in the US. They have some very good trade analysts on board there, and they've been through it, and Obama and the Americans are raving about how much better it is on the environmental impacts, on the environmental side. But again, the rules aren't strong enough. The multilateral environmental agreements, what we've had for years, they get overridden by the investor state. There's an environmental side agreement. We've had that on NAFTA too. Started out all right, but then once it started to do some good, even Professor Stephen Clarkson, who sadly just passed away and was one of our greatest academics in this country on these issues, he spoke about, you know, the detriment to the environment by the politicians basically sidelining the environmental agreement. And this has happened time and again. So we've still got that happening with this agreement. And then as well, the investor state is still going to allow that further attacks on environmental legislation. The regulatory cooperation coherence chapter looks like we can have corporations influencing how our regulations and so on are made. And the other disturbing thing is that fracking and other sources of fossil fuel extraction and exports will be enhanced, will be allowed within this agreement if it goes through. And I think that's one of the ones we have to be very concerned about, plus agricultural issues which relate to the environment as well. Climate action, this is really an important one. The TPP will hurt the climate goals by expanding the rights of corporations to challenge regulations. That's the investor state, and we've already seen that that's come into play in several instances. It drives natural gas exports and production, which is contrary to what we want. And it limits support for local renewable energy systems, which we saw in Ontario when they tried to put in their green energy plan and to try to have a little employment created and to create some of their own products for their energy system. And then immediately they were sued or taken to court by Japan and Europe and through the WTO, I think that was. So then you have the Council of Canadians was right on the front line here, recognizing the need to have a carve-out at the Paris conference so that the investor state wouldn't be used against any good suggestions that are made to delimit this kind of fossil fuel economy. We already saw with the German Vattenfall case, which is the case where Germany tried to phase out its power plants. The companies supplying the materials and the plants came right back with a major multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. So Gus Van Harten did write a piece of legislation that could be added. So this might be something too, if you're talking about organizing, to really push for this, because this is one of the Council of Canadian things. There's Maud was big writing on this, and I'm not sure whether she wasn't even the one that suggested to Gus that they do that. Then, especially in the U.S., a lot of the NGOs and university folks are decrying this latest Trans-Canada pipeline NAFTA case after Obama refused to let the Keystone Pipeline go through. So I don't think anything more needs to be said about that. I mean, it's very it shows how difficult and how bad this investor state can be if we're trying to stop climate change. They've been so used to having their way, you know, that the economy in the last 20 to 30 years has always trumped the public sector and the public good. So again, we're going to have to see where that all comes. But and then Ben Beachy, who's the analyst for Sierra Club now, he said, as they stand, these trade agreements are the single biggest threat to meeting our climate change goals, which the Canadian government proudly announced only a month ago. So there we go. I don't know how they're going to get through this one if they keep talking out of both sides of their mouth. And the regulatory harmonization, I've got two references there for you. What Stiglitz says is what they want is stripping away regulations, harmonizing down, not upward, to the citizens' advantage. Harmonizing to a standard that is to the advantage of big pharma against American people, European people, and so on. But not just in pharmaceuticals, but in many, many areas. That's just the one he mentioned. And it says, okay, let's just keep going here. So we're getting towards the end. How much time have we got, Sujata?
We're about 5 to 2, so about 5 minutes or so, 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, we started a little bit late, so let's say 10 minutes.
So I'm saying we can go till 2:10 or something.
Okay, that would be perfect. I think we'll get through it then. We're getting there. Now, what is this whole investor-state dispute settlement? It's a really hard one to get our heads around, and I finally, about a year and a half ago, when I had to get back involved with the Digby Net Quarry case again, which I'd worked on to stop, and which we did stop, and then Vilcon, the company, sued, and they won their case, and so we had to go back again. We're back on looking at that again, and so at that point, I really tried to dig in and see what this was all about, and I realized one of the reasons we hadn't been able to make a good point is because we didn't go into it enough detail, and Professor Gus Van Harten really sort of cracked this one open when he laid out, what, and in the other agencies and other writers have as well. But this is basically what I gleaned from the studies, and that is, we know that there's a series of corporate rights that are built into investment agreements, and this came with the NAFTA agreement, that you give any foreign company national treatment, most favored nation treatment, minimal standard of treatment, which has a subtext of fair and equal treatment, which was one of the things that came into play with the Digby Net Quarry, and then expropriation. And the danger there is it's not just expropriation of the physical factories and properties, which is what it was originally meant to be in early investment agreements back around the time the European empires were collapsing and all of the the new countries were setting up and having investments coming in, people were afraid that they might be expropriated, they might be nationalized. But now, when you've got northern countries against northern countries, that doesn't work. That's not what's going to happen. So the way it's written is that they can sue for lost profits. So you can have a company that was like in Digby Neck was just a front company, and that they're suing now for $333 million because they were stopped. So that's what the rights are. Then they had this privatized dispute settlement. Instead of having a domestic court, although I think they could choose to go to a domestic court, but most of the times they go to what they call these offshore courts. And they call them international, but they're not like a true international court. They're privatized. They have private sector international trade lawyers instead of permanent lawyers paid by the public sector. They have no tenure like a proper judge in a court would. There's no body of established law. There's no permanent court or location, although sometimes they go to the World Bank. There's several different courts that in name are, but a lot of times they just meet in hotel rooms. There's big conflict of interest. If you look on the right of that slide, that was a really good report the Corporate Europe group, one of our colleagues in Europe, put together, profiting from injustice. And in the links under ISDS to the two films that I've got there, one German and one Dutch, it really shows, the conflict of interest that's going on there. It is a huge money-making business for international trade lawyers now to get involved in these cases, and even to push the idea with the companies that they can do this, so that it's almost becoming a way for corporations and lawyers to make money. So you can't have that with a proper international court or domestic court. So the rulings don't rely on binding precedent. I found this out when I was researching how the decision in Digby Neck was made, and it was shocking. Huge awards for damages paid out by governments. In a normal court case, in a normal court, there's no damages. So they've got this written in as well. So you can see this one is really warped on the side of the corporations. And there was no appeal process brought in. So even though Digby Neck was known by the one dissenting arbitration tribunalist, it was known to be flawed, and it should have been a case that went to a domestic court. There was still no true appeal process that for our government. Although right now there's something in the works, I think. Anyway, and it's for corporations only. Governments can't sue the corporations. So I just wanted to point that out so that you can see that there's a really good case. Now, because this case has been made so well, the CETA agreement in Europe, what they've done there is they've tried to pick out a few of these things to make it fairer, and I'll point that out in a few minutes. And these are some of the analyses that show what's happening in the investment chapter of the TPP, because it's different than the one in the CETA agreement. So I'm not going into that, but just to know it hasn't changed much. And before I go to that, these are the issues now. This is the commissioner, Cecilia Malmström, the commissioner for the European Commission, that has helped to create a slightly better agreement. But the problem is, they tried to build in a right to regulate, but our guys, these are international lawyers and experts, have said that it hardly generates any meaningful power of constraint to have the right to regulate. A new method of selecting arbitrators, and there would be a right to appeal. But there's still these issues that the corporations still have all those built-in rights to challenge and strike down laws, and it sets high standards for protection of foreign investors by all these other things. And there's Armad, and she says, the reworked pact still gives foreign companies a unique forum in which they can challenge domestic laws. And then David Schneiderman had an excellent article in the Globe and Mail just recently. I'm not going to go read it right now because we're trying to skip through. There's still other alternatives, because that CETA one, we don't feel it's gone far enough. That she actually asked for a full-fledged international investment court, which would be like the other UN courts, and it would be fair. But people said, oh, it would take too long. But that is still a possibility, and Gus Van Harten, professor at Osgoode Hall, is one of our experts on that. rejection of ISDS back to the state-to-state arbitration. I've read about insurance through the World Bank that companies could get if they're worried about anything. And in the Caribbean area, there was a declaration of 12 countries to form a conference of the states to deal with challenges posed. So they were going to set their own thing up. I don't know what's happened to that. Those are some links that you might be able to click on when this gets up online, because there were 2 films made, and one of them was in Digby Neck, the German documentary. I worked with the producer to help get some interviews set up and met him when he was here. It's very good. And then finally, the recommendations. Now, this is what the Council of Canadians has said. Establish a full public review, including a comprehensive and independent analysis of the TPP text by the Parliamentary Budget Officer that would assess the deal's impact on all of these areas. Now, I can only assume that with this new parliamentary committee process and hearings that was announced, they did say they're going to study it. So I think this is one thing the Council will want to do, is to make sure that that parliamentary committee is actually doing this kind of a study that they've asked for the Parliamentary Budget Officer to do. That would be important. Then, I think I mentioned this, the International Institute for Sustainable Development recommended that governments not ratify the agreement as it is. Rather, the TPP should act as a jumping off point for a new global dialogue on the right direction for trade agreements. I really like this one. They said it is time for Canada to lead in reevaluating what type of trade agreements are needed for this century. Then they said Canada now has a unique opportunity to step back, reflect, and then return to lead global trade law into a sustainable development era. And I think Howard Mann, who also is their senior advisor at the IASD, made that statement. So I think these are really important things now for us to pick up on. That was just published in the newspaper like 2 or 3 days ago. So this is the other thing. When we're doing the activism and the organizing for this, it's going to be really important to keep on top of the flow of information and knowledge that's coming out daily almost on this, so that we don't get out there and start rooting for the wrong thing. So that's good that we can work together on that. Also, this was a thought of mine, that establish a think tank on economic alternatives, which would have NGOs, institutes, academics, and the social movements involved, not just the usual government agents and negotiators. We need to be thinking to the future, as we're thinking to the future of what kind of trade agreements we need. As the IISD said, we have to know what kind of an economic system we're going to need. And as I said, there are many, many other systems that we could be thinking of now. And then finally, and I just heard about this yesterday when I was posting an obituary about Stephen Clarkson, Professor Stephen Clarkson, who I'd met and whose work I greatly admire. He had been working, according to one of my colleagues, he had been working on an international conference to take place next year with the goal of setting rules governing the activities of multinationals that affect the rights of sovereign nations. I think we must ensure that this important conference happens. That's going to be crucial, and I believe it probably will. But I put that information out into the trade networks now, so I think that somehow that will happen. This was what Justin Trudeau said when he was elected, that they'll hold full and open public debate to ensure that Canadians are consulted. Don't like that word, are consulted. I mean, it's more to have input. But anyway, so then they came up with this website, and where you could send your commentary as an individual. But again, that's not real participatory democracy. So yesterday, March the 10th, or the day before, what was it, 2 days ago, this press release came out, and I don't know how many of you saw it, so I'll just highlight a couple of things, because this is almost the last slide. The House of Commons Standing Committee on International Trade decided to conduct a study on the TPP agreement. The committee's primary objective is to assess the extent to which the agreement, once implemented, would be in the best interest of Canadians, and it will result in a report. So that's where, when they're doing this study, the Council of Canadians can push to make sure that that their recommendation through the budget officer, that all of those suggestions would be inherent in this study. And then, as part of its study, the committee is inviting Canadian individuals and organizations to provide written submissions that express their views on the TPP agreement, and it's also inviting Canadians to request to appear as witnesses before the committee. And if you look down below, this is exciting. They think they're going to be able to do it. They expect to hold hearings across Canada over the coming months. Once cross-country hearings are confirmed, information will be provided about dates and locations. So this might be another thing to add to your list, Jennifer, in the organizing to as a target to prepare, for many members to be ready for, the hearings, or different regional groups to be ready to participate in those hearings. And there's guidelines, the submissions to be no more than 1,500 words, and there's a place to submit. And if you wish to appear as a witness, make the request anytime during the study, which would be before the end of April, I think. So those are just some things. I put a very minimal version of this together 2 or 3 months ago, and I presented it to a little group we have here called Cinema Politique. And these were some things I had written at the time. I'm sure it's a bit presumptive to even bother sharing them with you people who are so well aware of all these things anyway, but I'll just go over it. Use and share this and other resources to learn more about the TPP, and share and learn from articles and info on social media. Call MP's office, set up visits to express your concerns, write letters to editors pointing out threats of the TPP, and demand more study consultation. Well, now we've got that. So another suggestion, and other people have said this, write in opposition to articles in newspapers which are blatantly false, providing evidence of concerns with the deal. Well, this PowerPoint hopefully would provide some of the information in terms of when they get it wrong about the promises of the TPP. Prepare for forthcoming rallies and marches on this issue, which I think you're doing. Organize learning events and discussions in communities, which you guys are really good at, and provide written submissions possibly to the parliamentary committee. And then that's it. Did I get through on time, Sujata? Hello?
Hi, Janet. It's Jennifer. You were exactly 1 hour from when we started. Thank you. That was
okay, good.
Beautiful. I'm not sure where Sujata, what happened with Sujata, but yeah, it was really empowering, and we've all in the comments down the side. Is that Sujata back? Yeah, she's back.
Sorry, I just lost a second of web, kind of a web senior moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as long as I was still connected, I worried I wasn't connected when I was talking there at the end.
5 seconds about a minute during the whole thing, and then I had to come back on, and then I forgot to put my mic back on. But yeah, this was a very, very interesting conversation. It gives us a lot of meat and a lot of substance and a lot of lot more detail that we can use. The history, what's in the agreement. This is a very, very much appreciated. And I'm sure that a lot of people have questions. So now we're going to be taking questions. So how it's going to work? Are there any people who are on the phone? Because some people could only come in by phone. Is there anyone who's on the phone?
So if they are, they can ask their question directly.
Right. You can also call in to that number if you want to ask your question by phone. I'm also going to start reading some of the comments in the chat. So I will be reading some of the questions, so you can ask by chat as well. So far, there's quite a lot of people saying thank you so much for the information. People are happy that we can pick up apart the information for our own use. There is Fiona saying, I'm in awe of how well Janet covered all that info in just an hour. I'm so exceedingly grateful. There's a thank you very much. Fantastic. So appreciated. A question about how can this presentation be accessed for sharing. I will have it put up and sent to the group at some point for everybody to have a copy of this.
Jennifer, can I just ask a question? That will be like a proper webinar posting where the people will hear the voice as well?
Well, I can do both. I'm going to talk to you about that offline, and we can see what we're going to do. I have both a recording of this and the PowerPoint, so we can talk about something will be. And I see Ruth Cook saying that please get this posted ASAP and no one organize this. Okay, thanks, Ruth. Okay, Ruth. Well, yeah, there'll be some way that we can get this posted. I'll get back to you about exactly how, but you'll all have a copy for sure.
Great.
Any chance we can have it tomorrow? Kathy, I can send a copy to you tomorrow, that's for sure. Jesse has a question. Sujatha says that CETA is a negative list. Exactly how does this affect municipalities?
With the negative list, you have to cite the things that you don't want on the list. And I think the way at the municipality level, in terms of, I don't know how it does, to tell you the truth, for everything, but I know in terms of the contracts, anything, it's $300,000 is the threshold. So they can, anything over 300,000 has to go out on a website and to be available for any corporation in Europe. And that could actually, that could be quite damaging because, for example, in this province, several of our municipalities work together in order to provide major services, so the contracts would be over 300,000, and they are not allowed to subdivide them. It could also impact our ability to increase our productivity for local food, because they like to use hospitals and schools to be able to have a dedicated market when they do grow more food, and that could be impacted as well. And I don't know in terms of some of the other aspects that we saw there about whether, I tell you the truth, I'm not quite sure about that one, but it's something we should look into, I guess, because I want to definitely write something on that for municipalities.
Okay, there's a number of people also asking to have the presentation on the TPP by Monday. I could try my best to get it sent to you. It's probably a very big file, so I'll send it to you by too big for email to the participants only, the video.
But now, when you're going to try to put it up online as well, are you?
Yeah, I'm going to try that, but they want it by Monday, so that I can't do.
Yeah, and I think there might be some advantage in having the audio, just like we did for the other two webinars earlier this week, because there was an awful lot more in the audio than there is in the PowerPoint.
This would be a whole video audio thing.
Yeah, okay, great. That would be great.
Okay, then Ken Collier says, I think we should be deeply skeptical of articles by Larry Summers, Joseph Stiglitz. Oh, shoot, I can't read the comment now. Oh, wait, I can. And books endorsed by Mikhail Gorbachev, former neoliberals, now recent converts to Keynesianism, use caution citing them and mention to their background. Stiglitz now appearing often in favorable terms, even Summers. So I guess that's a comment.
Yeah, I could just respond. I'm quite aware, and that Stiglitz, not Stiglitz, but especially Larry Summers, he was our nemesis in the anti-globalization movement for years. The point I'm making is he is a turncoat, but even he, as a former neoliberal, is willing to admit that we may have come to the end of growth. That was the only point. But I agree with the whoever said that, that we do have to be cautious on that front.
Lynn Grist, there's a lot of contracting out of public spaces like health and education that are contracting out in Europe. Is that part of the CETA agreement?
Sorry, would you read that again?
There is a lot of contracting out of public services like health and education in Europe. Is that part of the CETA agreement?
Well, I think the CETA agreement will allow for that to happen even more so. It's certainly not going to stop it. And the services agreement, the TISA agreement, will have a lot more to say about that.
I can talk a little bit about CETA because we've been campaigning in Europe on CETA.
Right.
And what happens with public services is that when you privatize a public service, you can no longer bring it back to the public realm. That's what happens because you can have ISDS kind of lawsuit. And what's happened is the European companies, a lot of the things that we do municipally as public services we do in the public realm. So if we were to make those things private, the European companies who are often involved in things like water and sanitation are really looking at that in terms of markets as well. And it's when you with CETA, when you put something a public service on if you privatize it, it's really hard to bring it back. The other thing that's happening is that through our municipalities, we are saying that anything that comes in terms of contracts, everyone has a right to bid on it, and that means that sometimes our public services we can't do buy local, and then the European companies then have access to those markets.
Fiona, yeah, that was the point I was making. I think, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, just a few things at the same time, so I hope that made sense. Fiona is saying CETA applies to subnational government, so that means sectors under provincial jurisdiction are vulnerable. I think that's a comment.
Yes.
Kathy Clark, what is the current status of TISA?
Do you have more information on that, Sujata? I know that from the Trade Justice Network perspective, it's something that we've got on the screen on the horizon, but haven't started working on it yet. And as I said, I think some of the unions are looking at this already.
Yeah, it's a very important issue. It's a very scary agreement from the things we've heard about it. Unfortunately, I haven't had the capacity to look at TISA, but I know that there's a lot of international groups that are working on TISA.
Yeah. It's definitely something that we should be looking at for sure. It's very, very worrisome.
Yeah, I agree. Are there any other questions? CETA Jesse saying, CETA, can municipalities be sued?
We think so. Wouldn't you say, Sujata?
Well, the thing is that what happens is with CETA and with all the agreements, what happens is you don't actually sue the subnational governments, you sue the Canadian government. So, but a municipality could make a decision that affects profits, and Canada is bound by the company can sue over municipal decisions, is what I'm saying.
They can. And one thing that Harper said, and I don't know that it's ever been clarified, but when the Abitibi case in Newfoundland was taking place over the rights to water under the ground, he said that in the future he would like to see the provinces where the case initiated be responsible for the payouts. And that would be a big, huge thing for some of our smaller provinces, especially if we sign on to these big agreements, bringing thousands more corporations into the capacity to sue. So that is a big issue.
Jesse is saying that CETA is the first agreement to include provinces and municipalities. Municipalities definitely. I think we're confusing two things. Oh God, there's too many questions now. I don't know how I'm going to answer them all. There's two things. ISDS applies to everyone, but what you're talking about is procurement. Procurement is when I'm a government and I go out and I contract different products. In that case, the municipalities have to open those markets to different to anyone in CETA. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about municipal and provincial governments. But at any point, ISDS affects any government decision that is made in NAFTA, whether it's NAFTA, CETA, or TPP.
Right. And there's quite it's quite an onerous task for a small municipality. Actually, I've been reading to try to get the information out on websites and to try to make the decisions and so on. They went through this in the New England states. They used to have globalization and committees, and I read some and looked at some PowerPoints about how negatively that affected the smaller states.
Question from Kathy Clark. Is the Council of Canadians considering a cross-country tour on the TPP? Yes. We are working on a very, very big project, but it's still kind of embryonic right now, a cross-country tour and consultation on the TPP. We also have CETA at the same time, so it's a bit of a juggling act because CETA is also coming down, and we're going to Europe for all of April because it'll be going to the European Parliament this year. But yes. Lynn Armstrong asks, TPP Chapter 9 says hearings will be open, but the anti-TPP literature says TPP will have secret tribunals. So what she's saying is she's heard that in Chapter 9 that the ISDS hearings will be open. So why do we think it's secret?
Well, we were basically saying that it was all secretive when it was being negotiated, and traditionally the ISDS tribunals have been secretive, but it's not just TPP that would be open. That's been for several years now. Some of them have chosen to be open, to accept briefs from other groups, and and many governments have been putting more and more information online as they realize the criticism that was coming. So that's nothing new. That doesn't necessarily make it right, just because there's a little more exposure.
Right. Julie Picken Cooper, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Would there be any point in trying to vote out NAFTA to stop the precedent of ISDS?
To vote it out? Is that what you said?
That's the question she's asking.
Well, first of all, you'd have to get a government to put it on the table to vote. That's not how you would do it, actually. Built into NAFTA is a clause that says you have 6 months that you could actually get out of that deal if you petition to do so, or you can put forward complaints and concerns about things that you want to have repealed. And a few years back, we had several political parties were on side to repeal the investor state and the proportionality clause on oil between Canada and the U.S. and several other aspects of it. Then that kind of died away. There was a time when even Michael Ignatieff floated that idea about the getting rid of the oil one, but it fell on deaf ears. So yes, there are ways built in to try to get out of some aspects of it, and actually the whole thing. But I think with some of the newer deals, that's what's worse about them, is that it would be years to get out of them, whereas, with NAFTA, it's only, I forget if it's 6 months, you can still appeal to get out. So I think with the FIPA with China, it's huge. It's like 50 or more than 30 years. And I think with the TPP, likewise.